Nathan Hayes woke before dawn to the sharp crackle of cold air seeping through the thin window by his bed. He stared at the cracked ceiling for a moment, letting the quiet hum of his mother's breathing from the next room remind him what today meant. He hadn't worn his old navy blue suit in months, but he'd ironed it twice last night just to smooth away the weight of doubt pressed into the fabric. He reached for his worn leather briefcase, checking the inside pocket one last time for his printed resume and the letter of recommendation he'd begged from his old manager. The apartment smelled faintly of burnt toast. His mother, Linda, stood at the tiny stove, her hair pinned up with a pencil, still in her robe and slippers. She turned when she heard his steps on the creaky floorboards, offering him a small smile that didn't quite hide the worry in her eyes. "You'll do fine," she said, her voice hoarse but warm. Nathan kissed her forehead, ignoring the quiet catch in her breath as he did. There wasn't time for more words. He had one chance to turn things around, and he knew it. Outside, the rusted old Chevy pickup groaned to life after the third try. He muttered a quick thanks to the engine and pulled out of the cracked parking lot, the steering wheel vibrating under his cold hands. The streets were empty except for the distant glare of a city bus rumbling. Toward downtown, Nathan's mind replayed the company name on the printed directions, Whitestone Marketing Solutions, not a giant firm, but big, enough to steady his life, big enough to finally pay the overdue power bill and the past-due hospital fees for his mother's diabetes treatments. The sun hadn't fully risen when Nathan found himself stuck behind a line of cars at a stubborn red light near the highway. En ramp, his eyes darted between the clock on the dash and the empty road, stretching ahead, 10 minutes behind schedule if the traffic stayed thick. He tapped his thumb against the wheel, forcing himself to breathe evenly. This job meant not just paying the bills, but reclaiming a piece of the future that had slipped away the day his factory job vanished under bankruptcy notices and locked gates. He glanced to his right and spotted a dark sedan pulled over to the shoulder. Steam drifted from under its half-open hood, mixing with the frosty dawn air. A woman in a slim dark coat stood beside it, phone in one hand, the other pressed against her forehead like she was trying to hold back panic. Nathan's eyes darted back to the green light blinking ahead. He could pretend he didn't see her, keep his foot steady on the gas, and save his one shot. But before he even realized it, he was easing onto the shoulder, the truck rattling to a stop behind her. Nathan stepped out, adjusting his tie out. Of habit, even as cold wind bit at his neck, the woman turned, startled, but her relief was quick to replace her suspicion. She looked polished, hair neatly pinned, heels that clearly weren't made for standing on gravel. Her phone screen was dark, dead battery, and her lips trembled as she explained that her car had sputtered and died without warning on her way to an important meeting downtown. She didn't say it outright, but Nathan could see the desperation in the way she clutched her coat tighter against the cold. "Mind if I take a look?" Nathan asked. She nodded, stepping aside, her breath forming anxious clouds in the sharp morning air. He lifted the hood, wincing at the hiss of steam and the faint whiff of burnt rubber. It wasn't just a dead battery, the serpentine belt had slipped loose. He cursed under his breath. This would take time. He shot a glance at the clock on his phone. 25 minutes until his interview. If he left now, he could still make it with only a flustered apology and maybe a second chance. But her eyes caught his. Nathan dug into the bed of his old truck, pulling out the battered toolbox his father had left him years ago. He knelt by her, bumper, fingers numb from the metal's cold bite. The woman hovered near him, his phone still dead, muttering apologies and half-finished offers to pay him. He waved her off, focusing instead on the worn belt, coaxing it back onto the pulleys, tightening it with an old wrench that had seen better days. His suit jacket brushed against oily metal. He didn't care. He could buy another suit if he ever got hired again. A car zipped past them on the highway, the roar of its engine pulling Nathan back to the ache in his knees and the reality pressing down on him. He could feel time slipping through his fingers faster than the oil staining his cuffs. He worked faster, knuckles scraping against cold bolts, breath coming out in misty clouds. Every tick of his watch told him the interview was already lost. But the look on the woman's face, a mix of helplessness and surprise, reminded him why he couldn't just leave her stranded. When the engine finally sputtered to life under his care, the woman let out a sharp laugh halfway to tears. She thanked him a dozen times, digging through her purse for cash he wouldn't take. She insisted, but he just shook his head, wiping grease off his palms onto an old rag. He told her he was glad she'd make her meeting, that he hoped it was something important. He didn't tell her about the interview. It wasn't her burden. He just watched her drive off, an exhaust trailing behind her like a ribbon of all the hours he'd just given away. Nathan sat in his truck a few minutes longer than he needed to, staring at the dashboard clock as it mocked him with cold numbers. He tried to tell himself there would be other interviews, other chances, but doubt crept in with the draft through the cracked window. He thought of his mother's hopeful smile that morning, her promise that today would be different. He let the engine idle until the cold faded from his hands, then pulled back onto the road toward the city, toward home, not toward the future he'd imagined for himself just hours ago. The city streets seemed cruelly bright as he drove past the office building where he was supposed to be shaking hands and answering questions right about now. He slowed as he passed, catching his reflection in the lobby glass. A man in a stained suit, tie crooked, shoulders heavy. With the weight of sacrifice, he wondered if anyone inside would have understood why he'd chosen to stop for a stranger. When his own life was falling apart at the seams, he wondered if they would have respected him more or less for it. Back home, the apartment smelled faintly of stale coffee. Linda sat by the window. When he came in, knitting needles paused mid-air when she saw the look on his face. He didn't have to say a word. She just reached for his hand, warm and soft. Despite the tremor that had started in her fingers months ago, he sat beside her, explaining everything in a low voice. The car, the woman, the engine belt, the clock. She didn't scold him for being foolish or reckless. She just pressed his knuckles to her cheek and whispered, "You did good." Nathan didn't sleep much that night. He lay awake on the thin couch beside the living room window, the city lights blinking. Through the cheap blinds, he thought about how one choice could spin a life in a new direction, or leave it standing still. He wondered if maybe, just maybe, life kept score in ways no bank account or résumé ever could. He drifted into an uneasy sleep just before dawn, one hand still stained with engine grease, the other curled loosely around the last shred of hope that sometimes doing the right thing had a way of circling back when you least expected it. Nathan woke to the sharp knock of opportunity dressed as surprise. It came 2 days later, when the morning sun caught him off guard while he was patching a leaky faucet for the elderly neighbor across the hall. His mother called out his name from the doorway, voice trembling with that same hope he'd nearly let die the day he missed his interview. He dried his hands on a threadbare towel, her heart thudding in the hollow of his chest. He hadn't applied for anything else yet. What good was hope when luck had turned its back for so long? At the door stood a man in a charcoal suit so crisp that Nathan's reflection looked out of place beside him. He introduced himself as Peter Lang, assistant to someone named Ms. Jordan. Nathan tried to place the name, but his mind spun circles around the idea that this suit, these polished shoes, were here for him. Peter didn't wait for Nathan to find his voice. He simply said, Miss Jordan had requested Nathan meet her downtown immediately. No résumé. Required no application forms. Just him, his name, and the grease still etched in his cracked knuckles. Nathan stared at his mother, half convinced he was still dreaming, but Linda only urged him on, pressing his old suit jacket into his hands like it was an armor that could shield him from disbelief. The drive downtown felt unreal, the city blocks blurred together. As the old truck rattled through streets that had once felt like a dead end, he found himself outside the Whitestone Marketing Solutions building, the same, one whose interview clock had run out just days ago. But this time he was guided past reception with polite nods and ushered into an elevator that smelled of polished wood and money. The doors opened onto a floor so bright and silent it felt like stepping onto a movie set. Peter led him through a corridor of glass walls and soft carpet until they stopped at a corner office with a view of the entire city skyline. There, framed by sunlight pouring through tall windows, stood the woman whose stranded car he'd fixed on that cold roadside. She turned at the sound of the door, a smile breaking the tight line of her lips, her posture relaxed, but her eyes sharp with recognition and gratitude that seemed too big to hold in such a pristine space. Miss Jordan, the CEO, Nathan realized in a single rush of disbelief, gestured for him to sit. She thanked him again for stopping, when no one else did, for giving up what he couldn't afford to lose. She told him how that meeting he saved her for had secured a contract that would keep hundreds employed for years. Nathan sat stunned as she explained she hadn't stopped thinking about the man in the worn suit who'd walked away from his own shot at a future just to help a stranger. Now she wanted to offer him something better than he dared to want for himself. She slid a folder across the polished desk. Inside was an offer letter with a salary Nathan couldn't have imagined even in his best-case dreams. But more than the numbers, it was the handwritten note at the bottom that made him swallow back. The tight knot in his throat. People like you build companies worth working for. Come build this with me. He looked up at her, trying to find the right words, but all he managed was a quiet thank you that carried every weight he'd buried for so long. She only nodded as if she already knew what it cost him to hope again. Peter walked him out, hand on his shoulder, promising to help him settle into his new role. Nathan stepped back onto the street, blinking against the bright winter sun, the city alive in a way it hadn't been for him in years. He called his mother from the sidewalk, voice breaking when he told her to put on a fresh pot of coffee. He was bringing home news that would finally lift the worry from her thin shoulders. She didn't speak at first, just breathed his name like a prayer that had finally found its answer on the cracked pavement of old dreams. Nathan started his first day at Whitestone with his sleeves rolled up and his tie a little crooked. Not because he didn't care, but because he refused to pretend to be someone he wasn't. The employees noticed. The stories of how he got there spread through whispered conversations by the break room coffee pot and down the echoing hallways. Some doubted the rumors. Others saw the way Ms. Jordan called him by his first name, the way she asked for his opinion when big decisions hovered on the edge of the conference table. Slowly, they understood he hadn't been hired by luck alone. Late one night, Nathan found himself alone at his new desk, city lights spilling in through the tall windows. He read reports he barely understood, but was determined to master. He stayed when others went home, not because he wanted to prove something, but because he knew how much had been risked to make this chance real. His mother's health bills no longer piled up unpaid by the toaster. The apartment felt less like a burden and more like a home. And every evening Nathan cleaned the oil from under his nails as a reminder of where he'd come from. Miss Jordan invited him to lunch a few weeks in, not at some fancy restaurant, but at the diner down the street from the office, where regulars in trucker caps and nurses on late shifts mixed like old family. Over coffee, she told him about the day. She'd watched him work under the hood of her dead car, how she'd stood by, not just helpless, but humbled by the kind of goodness that couldn't be faked for a paycheck. She said the world needed more. People who said yes when they had every reason to say no. Nathan listened, his coffee going cold in his hands. The company grew. Projects Nathan touched carried a quiet honesty that drew clients in ways no sales pitch ever could. He spoke to new hires the way Miss Jordan had spoken to him, reminding them that worth wasn't measured by clean shirts or perfect résumés, but by choices made when no one was watching. When a young intern asked him once what his secret was, and Nathan only smiled and said, "Help where you can. The rest finds its way back when you least expect it." He didn't bother explaining the old pickup or the half-frozen roadside. Some stories told themselves. On the anniversary of his first day, Miss Jordan brought him a small envelope. Inside was a key, not to an office or a new car, but to a mentorship fund she wanted him to run. A way, she said, for people like him to find people like he used to be. He kept that key on his ring next to the house key for his mother's new apartment, where she no longer worried about power bills or missed prescriptions. Nathan drove his old truck every Sunday to remind himself that the road ahead was never promised, only built one honest mile at a time. Sometimes when the city slept and the boardroom lights dimmed, Nathan would stand by the glass wall of his office, the skyline stretching like possibility into the distance. He thought about the day he'd missed his interview and how, in losing what he thought he needed most, he'd found something better than a paycheck. He'd found proof that what you give away freely comes back with interest if your hands stay open long. Enough. He smiled at the reflection of the man he'd become. Sleeves rolled up, tie still a little crooked, and his mother's hope stitched into every careful choice he made.